Welcome to Calgary Conversations, a podcast of the City of Calgary where we aim to have frank conversations with city leaders about the issues and topics impacting Calgarians.
Please stand behind the yellow line.
My name is Jose Rodriguez. I am the leader of Media Relations and Employee Communications at the City, and I'm happy to be your host. Welcome back to Calgary Conversations. And today we're going to discuss all things budget, and who better to do that with than our Chief Financial Officer, Les Tochor. Les, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So the budget's a big document, but it is sort of divided into two parts, which is the operating budget and the capital budget. Can you maybe explain that to us?
So in terms of the budget documents that we put together for the 2026 adjustments, we were really trying to simplify the documents overall and create a series of documents that were easier to understand. And so the format has changed. And that format is, we started with a bit of an overview of the entire city and how we compare it to other organizations. And then we moved into the operating. And the operating budget is really those expenditures that people might characterize as meeting the day-to-day needs. So those pay for example, salary for police, fire, our staff across the organization. And then when we move into the capital portion of our budget, those are things that are more permanent related or fixed assets. So those are areas where we'd build fire halls, police stations, bridges, road exchanges, those types of things.
But basically one is the account which we run the city with, and the other one is the account which we build the city with. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a good summarization. Yeah. That's right.
So now the city budget's always a hot topic with Calgarians. And so the big question is, what do we pay and what do we get? Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
So I'll start off backing up a little bit. The current process we just completed was really talking about year 4 of a 4-year plan. And so that plan was created 4 years ago with estimates of what would be expected for expenditures and revenues going into 2026, the last year. And so when we brought this budget forward in front of the new council, it had those aspects from the projections from the 4-year plan originally approved by the prior council, as well as adjustments the prior council approved and directed based on new information of what the City of Calgary looks like, whether it's inflation, whether it's the growth of our population, whether it's increased repairs to roads, those types of things. All of those were built into the documents that we walked through over the last couple of weeks. And so what Calgarians are receiving is really a focus across 4 major areas that they highlighted to us as impactful or important to them. And we moved through with focus on public safety, infrastructure, transit, and housing. And in terms of what people could see or will see, there's a real drive to maintain the service levels we have against a growing population and constant inflation that City of Calgary is a purchaser, just like a homeowner, and we face those same pressures. In addition to that, there are certain areas that were approved and directed by council, as I said, over the last couple of weeks, that really bring a focus onto certain areas of transit, safety, and recreation. And so as we move into 2026, citizens will be able to see those major areas. And then some of the bigger projects, for example, recreation, those will go into the subsequent year as well.
So what does this mean for the average household as far as a tax increase?
So when we look at tax increases, just to step back for a minute, the conversation we had with council was really focused on the additional tax revenue that the city needs to collect in order to deliver on all of the items in the fourth year of the 4-year plan. And to that effect, we started at what was previously recommended at 3.6%. And then as a result of the amendments that moved through, that percentage of the income that we needed to collect, that was decreased down to 1.64%. And how that translates into the average household it would turn into about $4.50 per month.
And that is the city's portion that we would finalize. We won't know from the province until later in Q1 of the year. Is that
That's
right?
correct. That's correct. All the conversation that we were in over the last, again, several weeks, and the amounts that I've used are just the amounts that City of Calgary can control. And that's just the municipal portion, not the provincial portion.
There were, you mentioned some key investments in those sort of priority areas. What's one that sticks out to you?
I think the one that for me personally, have the most connection with is dollars that are spent around safety. And I think for people to feel safe allows them to feel like they're at home. So anytime we can devote resources and dollars to areas that make Calgarians feel more safe, myself included, for me, that has the most impact.
So last brand new council, first time they're seeing the budget. They really dug in. There's 43 amendments. We heard 120 plus public speakers, I believe. Took 8 days, but they really dug in. Can you talk a little bit about how deliberations went?
Well, I think overall, the deliberations had a great outcome for Calgarians. The focus was really driven around what does affordability mean to Calgarians and across many spectrums. So whether it's the tax rate or whether it's someone experiencing and utilizing some of the city services, that definitely was front and foremost for council. And the other part that was interesting to watch as the new council was spending more time together is they really seemed to have a group think. Like they were really thinking as a team. There seemed to be a lot of conversations that individuals would come with varying ideas, but yet at the end they were able to come together and come out with a solution that worked for Calgarians. And I think as evident by the reduction in the municipal tax rate that Calgarians are going to see in 2026. So I think overall it was a great experience and for Calgarians, and also I have to say from my own vantage point, it was interesting to watch the group work together, especially such a new group that was brought together.
Yeah, I mean, they lowered the tax rate and they invested in their priority areas. I think you can chalk it up as a win.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, I think it was a very, very positive outcome.
Which leads right into my next question. We've set a budget for this year. Next year, we're going into a 4-year plan. Can the budget be changed each of those 4 years?
Definitely. So we started planning for the 4-year cycle yesterday. So we had our first meeting on starting to build out the plan. And the 4-year cycle is really carries, I think, a unique value. It allows our council to think about where big changes and big ideas can come into play for Calgary. And so the 4-year allows them to get an understanding that if we're going to start something big or make a change, how will it impact Calgary and how will it impact the outcome? And it gives 4 years to look at how to ramp up for that. The adjustments, it will be the same process that we have followed in the past, is that when we get into year 2 of the 4-year cycle, we would then go into this exact adjustment period, and the city would use our surveys, council would be listening to their constituents, we would have an open forum for the public to come and share their ideas, and that would then form the basis of how we adjust year 2, year 3, and year 4.
And this is, as you mentioned, a brand new council. They are working on the last year of the last council's budget. How do they then contribute to setting the budget? Or how do you and your team work with them to set the next 4 years?
So we start with council in early in the year around strategy sessions to capture their ideas around what are priorities, what are their areas of interest, what do they believe are the most impactful areas for Calgarians. And then we start to model what that looks like and how big a change is it from a financial perspective, from a resource and staff perspective, but as well as the time and duration. Large projects do have a certain timeline to them, whether it's through going through a procurement process, doing contracting, just the actual constructing of some of our larger fixed assets. So those, we work with council to go through what that would look like and how that would impact each of the 4 years for them to be able to meet the changing priorities or the changing interests that they've heard and want to bring to the City of Calgary.
And now you touched on this briefly a little while ago. Population, how does population factor into our budgeting?
So population has an impact in more than one place. Many people connect population increase with more doors or more houses that we would then apply our tax to and have more revenue. But that's a small portion. In many cases, we have people move to Calgary who are not buying a home. They're renting. And so those homes are already, those buildings are already within our tax base. So from a revenue perspective, it's not a direct linkage. So there are new homes that are being built for individuals, but also a lot of people are on our existing tax base. The other side of the equation is the expense side. And so the more people we have moving to Calgary, the more demand we have on our services. And so there's a direct demand when we think about recreation facilities, parks, et cetera. And then there's also a physical demand. So on our roadways, those types of things, there's more cars on the roads, there's more people using transit and our C trains, et cetera. So there's more demand. And for that, we've got to manage the increased draw on expenses.
We often hear about reserves, the rainy day fund. How do those work and how are they applied to this budget?
So reserves overall are investments that the city sets aside in terms of either managing risk, so things that we don't expect to happen in the future, and to be able to be prepared for that, and also a way to build up investments or cash to be able to build a big asset. So big assets take us more than 1 year to accumulate enough dollars to be able to build. So that's overall the purpose of the reserves we have. In many cases, people talk about the Fiscal Stability Reserve as the rainy day fund. I refer to that more from a risk management perspective, that fund allows council the discretion in the event that something large that we didn't predict or a catastrophic event occurs, we have the resources to deal with that type of situation. And in terms of the flow or how these reserves are functionally managed, at the end of each year, we go through the financial statement process, and where we have positive variances from our operating, those will move into the FSR or the Fiscal Stability Reserve, and that's a way that reserve gets replenished. Other reserves, in their terms of reference or in their directions for each reserve, have certain instructions that a certain amount of dollars or a percentage of another amount are to be moved into those reserves every year to replenish them.
Yeah.
Very much more restricted in terms of how they acquire dollars or how dollars are added, but also how the dollars are used. And so some are very specific to a certain type of capital asset, certain type of building, infrastructure. Others are specifically around certain types of operations. And snow clearing is a good example of that. So it's really, at the highest level, it's about managing risk and building up enough reserves or enough assets to be able to build some larger infrastructure or asset.
And as you were mentioning, some of these reserves are earmarked for very specific things. So for instance, we had something happen with one of our utilities. It has its own reserve.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So at a very high level, we have reserves that are in place to help manage risk around utility assets. We have certain reserves around large capital that we're planning to build in the future. And then we also have what I would call operating reserves or sustainment reserves to help on a regular basis should there be volatility that we just didn't expect. And then the last, of course, is the Fiscal Stability Reserve. That's more of a general reserve. It has the lowest amount of restrictions, and that gives council the most flexibility to be able to react to a situation.
And you touched on it earlier, but we use how we compare to other municipalities as part of our thinking around when we build the budget. How do we compare?
So that's an area that we added into the budget documents this year because there were a lot of questions in last year and earlier on, and this really helped us ground ourselves. So in terms of our 5-year average increase in taxes, we're the lowest when compared to large municipalities across Canada. When we look at our amount of property tax per household or per income for our taxpayers, we're below average relative to, again, the other municipalities within Canada. So from our perspective, we look at that as not the answer when people say, can you be lower on taxes? But it's more of a grounding to say, how are we doing relative to other municipalities? But we continue to look for ways to either be more efficient, to defer expenses, or to be a way thinking about using other assets to be able to keep the tax rate as low as possible.
Yeah, not going to the taxpayer every time.
That's
if we
right.
have other solutions. There's a lot of things that were brought up during deliberations, a lot of amendments that were passed. And one of the big ones was the tax shift. Can you maybe explain how the tax shift works?
So the tax shift that was applied and approved by the prior council was essentially to move 1% from the non-residential taxpaying group to the residential taxpaying group. And the reason behind that is currently in Calgary, we have a very high ratio. And there's a threshold in legislation that you can't go over 5 times. That ratio can't be 5 times greater. And currently we are, depending on where we were in the process, between 4.6 and 4.4. So in that ratio, we're getting close to that. And in previous years, the amount or the rate of increase of the property assessments for residential homes was increasing so dramatically that we were at risk of breaking through that 5 or that 5 times ratio. And so the council of the day then approved a tax shift, which for over 3 years started to move 1% per year in that shift. And what that did is it resulted in a rather significant differential when we applied a tax rate. So if we were, our original documents in the original proposal, our required increase in tax revenue was 3.6%. When we looked at it between the two groups, residential, the math would have worked out to be approximately 5.4, and non-residential would have been about 1.3. So that 1% has a very large impact. And by deferring that or removing it, that allows us, when we first passed that amendment, then we were really looking at a sort of a flat playing field of 3.6 to 3.6. And that was, I would say, the starting point when we moved into the more detailed amendments.
Nice. And just for clarity's sake, non-residential basically means businesses or other, not your home.
That's
right?
correct.
Is the definition of it. One thing we didn't talk about is investment income. The city does very well on investment income. I've seen you do the presentations, and we're very good investors. But there was a change that was put into the investment income and how it's going to be used. Can you maybe talk about that?
For sure. And yes, the Treasury team does a great job in managing our investments. And where we compare to other municipalities is we have a very strong investment base. And that allows us to have these types of flexibilities with our investment income. The change that was brought forward in an amendment was to adjust the methodology that the city follows in how much of our total investment income is applied and added to reserves every year. And in the past, it was a very high percentage, and that percentage had a variable amount. So as we earned more income, more of that amount went into the reserves. And we took a look at that, and we did some analysis that brought us to the conclusion that really we could look at using investment income to basically shelter inflation. So we would add to inflation, the rate of inflation, plus 0.4% to allow for some growth in these reserves. And that really then allowed the city to have more dollars, more investment dollars to be applied to base budget. And so that change basically shifts those investment returns to allow us to do things that will impact Calgarians on an annual basis. Reserves often have more of a long-term approach. So those reserves are set aside and as I mentioned, with capital, it could be multi-year. With the fiscal stability reserve, it could be even longer in preparing or managing risk. So by moving that $50 million amount of investment income to be applied within the base budget, that allows that to work for Calgarians in 2026, to be able to provide the services that were in the budget documents, but also to reduce the amount of taxes that we have to have in revenue.
It's going in with a head start, kind of.
That's correct. Yeah.
One of the places that got some funding, which was quite exciting, was Game Plan. And we're going to see some rec facilities being built. Can you maybe talk about that?
Well, there was a lot of energy through.
Well, we had soccer teams, we had cricket teams.
It made the public portion very interesting. And where it was concluded by council was that we would be starting the work on a facility in the Northeast. And so we were able to, with the direction of council, manage some of that exposure through existing reserves that we had set up, as I mentioned, for a capital reserve. And so some of those resources are coming from that reserve. And then there's a portion coming from the fiscal stability reserve as well. And so that allowed us to move that project forward. And I think that when we talk about what will Calgarians see when that center is completed, I think that'll have a very large impact in the eyes of Calgarians.
Well, Les, thank you very much for spending some time with me today. Is there anything I forgot to ask you? Anything you want to add?
I think just to add at the end, just comments around thanks. Thanks to council for taking us through the deliberations and really trusting the information that we had for them. We had a lot of questions that helped them understand more, but I think also highlighted some of the information that we had available to be able to share. I think Calgarians would be the next group to say thank you to, and also ask and their continued participation, whether it's through the citizen surveys or as they come to these public forums to be able to share their thoughts, whether it's directly with their councillor or right inside council chambers. That takes a lot of time and energy, and really a large thank you to them for dedicating that time and that interest. We have a lot of information at City of Calgary that we put out, whether digitally or in paper, and for Calgarians to go through that and then to base questions or comments on that, that takes a lot. So thank you to Calgarians. And I think the last group I really want to say a thank you to is to our staff. This project started moving these new budget documents forward in January of this year, and there were countless teams that have been working on it through the entire year. We saw a lot of people a lot of staff in our chambers throughout deliberations, but we had hundreds in the background preparing information, preparing additional analytics, and answering the questions that were coming up through council, but also through the public. So really just a big thank you to those three groups.
Awesome. Well, thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. As always, we value your feedback, so please reach out to us at Calgary Conversations at calgary.ca and tell us what topics you'd like covered and questions you'd like answered. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to each other, and if you see someone without a smile today, give them yours. Take care.